would you tell a story? I said, yeah, well, I must have a few. And then I thought, I've only been doing this over 50 years, I guess. But I thought that what I might share with you, which also kind of illustrates a lot in the history of psychedelic research, is just how a nice guy like me ever got involved in this field. And in my book, Sacred Knowledge, which some of you know, I kind of give an outline of this, but I'll give you the more comprehensive story. And that goes back to 1963. I was at Yale Divinity School, believe it or not, a 3-year theological training program. And for my second year, I decided to go to the University of Göttingen in Germany to study theology. Fascinating year. All the interesting stuff was going on in the School of Medicine. I found the School of Theology unbearably pedantic as a whole. But anyway, in the backyard of where I was living was the University Psychiatric Clinic, where Hans Karl Leuner, one of probably the primary European researcher with psychedelics, was doing his research. And 2 of my new friends participated in a research project he had going. One, it was alleged that he had some drug that helped you remember early childhood. And the name of the drug was psilocybin, but I hadn't even heard the word psychedelic at that time. And one of my friends regressed to childhood and experienced himself sitting in his father's arms, and his father had been killed in the war, and it was just profoundly therapeutic for him. And the other one saw visions of SS men marching in the streets that he called a hallucination. I thought, gee, I've never seen a hallucination. That might be neat, you know? So I went over. The screening was, did I get drunk very often? And did I consider myself in decent health? No to the first, yes to the second. So they led me to a little basement room, just a little cot and an end table with a narrow window looking out over the hospital garbage cans. And they gave me an injection of psilocybin and left me alone. You know, they didn't know any better in those days. And Leuner had just written a book called The Experimental Psychose, the experimental psychoses, how these paranoid states happen so reliably and so on. So I grew up Methodist, and I decided God would be with me if I had to relive any deep secrets about my Oedipal complex. And so I went in with kind of a decision to trust. And to my absolute amazement, this incredibly profound transcendental experience opened up, which I didn't even know was possible. And all of a sudden, the best way I can put it into words, my consciousness was in some eternal place looking back on history, and totally awestruck. And in the middle of that, the research assistant, Gerhard Baer, came in to test my knee reflexes. And he had me sit on the edge of the cot, and he was hitting my knee with his little hammer. He was wearing a white coat and jotting down this important scientific data. And I remember sitting there with arms outstretched, feeling compassion for the infancy of science. That they just had no idea what was going on, you know, or how incredibly awesome this was. And finally, the drug wore off. I tried to express a few words, and I went back to my dorm and lay down prostrate like a monk before the altar on my floor and just was overcome with gratitude and awe. And then that led to being a volunteer in Leuner's clinic. I was this interesting American who had the mystical experience, which for some reason was very rare. I think because there was low dosage and there was no support, most people just had very mild psychodynamic experiences. Why I had the mystical experience, I didn't know if it was I was just under a lot of stress or I was close to being schizophrenic or who knows, but it certainly happened. So then I became this volunteer in the clinic. And you have to remember in these days, 63, psychedelics were legal. There was no controversy. It was a perfectly rational thing to give a psychedelic to a graduate student, especially if they wrote a good report. You know, this is just education. What's the big deal, you know? I don't want to go on too long here. How am I doing? Can I have 5 more minutes? Yeah. Okay. The research design, interestingly enough, it actually wasn't the full C36 psilocybin. It was 2 derivatives, CZ74 and CEY19. And you agreed to receive it 4 times. So it was the 2 derivatives in 2 doses. So I had signed up for a series of 4 experiments. And the next 3, even though the dose went up, were not mystical at all. They had some interesting philosophical rumination. And I remember at the end of the 4th one saying, my gosh, was I just gullible? Did I just exaggerate what happened? Was this really just sexual pleasure and I decided it was mystical? You know, not that sex can't be mystical. And at that point, Walter Pankey came through and we met in the clinic and became friends. And he went to Lauren and he said, why don't we give Bill Richards a little higher dose? And let's take him out of the basement into a room with some plants and sunlight, and let me hang out with him in case he might want to hold a hand during the day. And this was the discovery, if you will, of supportive set and setting in Germany, you know? And needless to say, that 5th experience, I would say it was one of the most profound of my life. And it completely validated the first one, and I've never doubted the significance of this field since. And then, of course, that led to a career in psychedelic research, which continues at Johns Hopkins, and all indices are that we're going strong. So I think that's enough. Thank you.